This is the original sill. We've numbered them 1 through 8 across. So this is number 3. And as I'm looking up in here, this bolster, this metal plate assembly, fitted up into these notches above. And below this, the truck was connected, so that when the motors did their forcing of moving the locomotive, the force would be transmitted through these bolts and through the sills here. And over time, they moved and worked and loosened the bolts up. From the top, water came pouring down in here, which also loosened things. So these sills are kind of soft. As I'm digging away with it, I'm pulling away small pieces here. And what we did on, I thought he did it on, yeah, this one here, he put a plug up inside. This is one of our volunteers, Tom Dow, and he made it in a plug which he epoxied in here, and then we'll drill new holes in there. I think we're going to have to do that all the way across. The problem with that is you're getting farther and farther away from the original, and I don't know how well the plugs are going to give the continuity. We tried to keep something so that each piece was a full piece and there was something tying one end to the other. It points out more and more that we're not going to be hauling a lot of freight cars around with this thing when we get done. Now the only thing that really ties the car together in addition to the wood is there's a long rod, 30-some feet long, that goes from one end to the other. It goes through the sill, the end sills on both ends, and essentially holds the couplers on and keeps the car together. So what we've done, you'll see it under here and you'll see it on top, is we have replaced the rotted out, disintegrated wood with new, old, vintage southern yellow pine, which is supposedly about 100 years old, which is the age of this locomotive. And with using the West System epoxy, have glued everything together. We're going to supplement that as the Atlantic Shore did. They didn't glue anything, but we're going to supplement it by dropping bolts down through so that everything will be solid, because we're not sure how this epoxy will stand the shock of the bouncing around that it gets when it's moving. Now, having said that, this is a marine system and it's used for building boats, which certainly you get even more twisting and racking than we would have. So you can see that he's put one piece here, and I'm not sure how many more we're going to do. Up here, he has notched out, there's a brace here which goes out to the coupler. So these notches were duplicating what was on there, but in order to get it to come out right, he's had to put a little bit back here, and that should be pretty solid. But you can see some of these are fairly good on the bottom, but they're none of them wonderful, because this car was exposed to so much outdoors, plus all the shaking and pulling that it did when it was moving. When we get up on the top, we can look down and see if there are any others. Some of them, of course, the top, on several of them, he's put pieces going the whole way.
Yeah. Go ahead.
All right. What you see here is a plug of the new, quote, vintage southern yellow pine, and that's filling in the area where the bolts that had come down from the top that eventually connected with the sill, the bolster, had rocked back and forth and had disintegrated the wood. And he's epoxied that in there, and that's quite solid. It looks to me like there's some others that will need doing also. We had to, that was done with a router, and we had to get a long bit, 4 inches long, in order to get up far enough inside of this to make it effective. Okay?
Okay.
Body bolster. A streetcar locomotive has 2 of them on each end. One is the one that's attached to the body, and then there's a similar, little bit smaller one that's upside down that is on the truck. And in the center, hard to see in this angle, is a cup. This has got the male portion that goes down, and then there's a similar one on the truck that socket, so that holds, that essentially keeps the wheels from just taking off on their own. That's what holds the whole thing together. Out here you have a side bearing, one on each side, that keeps the locomotive stable. So you've got the same thing on both ends. The original to this, which is right there, was very badly corroded. I'd say in some areas more than 2/3 of the steel was gone. So we made measurements as best we could from that, and we fabricated this. This is a piece of 3/4 inch by 8 inch plate. The bottom is 1 inch by 8 inch plate. This is starting to burn. We were able to bore all the holes and were able to bolt it all together, but we could not bend this. So Novel Ironworks in Greenland, New Hampshire, just near Portsmouth, did this for us at a very, very reasonable price. They were quite interested in the historic aspects of all this, so they made it affordable for us and did the bending, and then we fitted the whole thing together. Now what we will do with this, very shortly, as soon as we're through with making sure that we've filled these holes as best we can, we're going to lift this up, push it against the end, and that will help stabilize everything, make it even and level, and we'll run bolts down through it. We may have to drop it back down in order to drill the holes if we have to, because it's a little hard to get it drilled in from this angle here. So we'll mark them and then take it down and then put it back up. Okay?
Okay.
All right, what you're seeing here is replacement of the deteriorated ends and tops of the longitudinal sills. There are 8 pieces that run from one end of the locomotive to the other, forming the deck and forming actually making this the framework of the whole car. And what we have done, as you can see, is glued new vintage yellow pine, southern yellow pine, on top of the original. We got down to, we figured about 3 inches in most cases. We got down and then we chiseled and belt sanded so there was a pretty smooth joint, and then using the West System epoxy glued these together. We will then put, as the Atlantic Shoreline did out here, put bolts, because they did the same job, but they didn't use any kind of glue. And we have replaced, there were several others that were like that, but we figured we're going to get back to a more solid base than it was there before. When this vehicle was first built, we're pretty sure that there were just bolts and washers dropping down to hold the bolster underneath. However, as the bolster is pulled by the motors and wheels, it tended to rock back and forth, go one way and then it would go the other way, and the moisture coming down from on top tended to deteriorate the sills here, and so you can see these 4 of them in the middle totally replaced on the top. This one has been replaced with a rotted out piece in the center. What Atlantic Shoreline did, or the York Utilities, we don't know exactly when it was done, they put those plates, which you can see with the bolts sticking out of them, and then the bolts went down through the sills and down through the bolster, giving you metal to metal, which was more solid. But we still think we're going to have to do some filling of the sills down below. We were considering whether we should or should not put those plates on because they weren't original, but on the other hand, I have a feeling they were on the car for a long part, and we're going to the 1935 to 40 period, which is far enough into the life of the car, so they must have done something like that at that point. The piece on the side, this side, was just set on top, and they used 1/4 inch steel here, and I'm debating whether to do something as solid as that or just get by with a 1/4 inch. I don't know. Some of these things you think about for a while, and finally comes a time and you just do it, depending either on what you have or what you have engineered to think is best. One thing I think you should show is the grain of the wood, and so that you get that a good picture of the end grain. These are called tenons, and there's a sill which goes across the end. It's basically about 8 inches high and 8 inches thick, and it's tenoned in. This gives you a good solid basis here. Now, having said that, this end had disintegrated, the sill had rotted away, as had some of the tenons. Fortunately, there were some left, and we will be able to replace the cut mortises in the sill and then glue it on here. It was not bolted. What holds this on here essentially is one long rod that also holds the coupler, and there's one here, two long rods. There's one here, and then on the outside you've got one here and one here. They go all the way to the other end, and they have bolts on them. Yes.
What I came in looking for was a
original grain. I don't know which one will show it the best, but this certainly when 100 was built in 1906, southern yellow pine in large dimensions of relatively clear and very dense wood was still available. This is the center of the wood, and you can see all the growth rings are very, very tight. What we've replaced the old wood with is supposedly vintage southern yellow pine, but you notice it's not quite as dense. It's certainly more dense than what you would find at your average home improvement store, and it's quite solid. In fact, when Tom Dow was doing the cutting on this, he could smell the resin which was still in the wood, even in the old wood, and this is what made this decay resistant. The southern yellow pine, not to be considered with Maine pine, which is quite soft, is pretty hard. This is very hard. This is less hard, but much better than what was there. This is a replacement tenon, obviously, and one of the things we noticed about this, that wood is not a perfect substance by any means, and it tends to twist with age, and this was twisted immediately. It was twisted before they finished the locomotive, and Laconia Car Company had compensated in order to get the tenons level. They had put them in at an angle so that it lined up with the sill that goes across the end. What Tom Dow has done is he's done that more, especially this one you notice, and so that the tops of all of the sills are level and even, because there's flooring, oak flooring that is nailed all the way across, and it's got to sit solidly. So all of that will tie together, the sill, the rods, the flooring on the top, to make this pretty solid. We're not going to haul any 100-car freight cars, trains behind this, but at least it will be solid enough so that we can haul maybe one if we're gentle with it. So we glued this on top and bottom, and this is soon ready for the bolts to hold it together. And then the next big job is to replace the two side sills. We couldn't afford to replace every one of these, and we probably shouldn't, because we would be getting so far away from the original fabric of the material. But we have decided to replace the two outside ones. This one over here was done, I'm told now, recently, that it was about 45 years ago that it was done here at the museum. I was around, but I had forgotten it was that long ago. This is made with spruce, one long piece of wood. It's a little too thick. They didn't have the means of getting it exactly to the right dimension, and the tenons weren't put on, and there were various other things that meant, even though the wood really hasn't rotted at all, it wasn't appropriate. So we will replace sill number 8, this one over here, and on the other side we have sill number 1, most of which is still here in some form or other. On one part, the Atlantic Shore or York Utilities had found that the top had disintegrated, so they replaced this top piece. But when we got in it initially, we thought that the wood was shaped like this and they had rabbited it out here. But then we found it was really a joint once we got down in there. so that all 8 of these are exactly the same dimensions, about 5, well, we'll see how much it is. I think it's 5 inches by approximately 12, yeah, see, 5 inches by 12 inches, southern yellow pine. So the new one will be vintage southern yellow pine, and it will replace this outer one. And one of the reasons we want a good one on the outside is because we are also putting the lettering for Atlantic Shoreline Railway on the side, and we need to have a piece that's relatively good. Now, having said that, it was interesting looking at a picture of 100 when it was new, or fairly new, and its sister cars. We noticed cracks already were there almost immediately. I mean, the wood is just not perfect substance, but the lettering looks fine, so that will really wasn't a problem. All right, I'll talk. The plates were, there were steel plates, which you can see over there, which were about 3/4 of an inch thick and 5 inches, 5-6 inches wide, that sat on here and acted as reinforcements to the bolts that went down through. And what we are going to do is we're going to notch every one of the sills and put them in. When the car was built originally, they didn't have them, but in the era we're doing it, 1935 to 1940, we're almost certain that they had them. So we're going to put them all the way. Whether we do the outside one or not is another question, because they used a thinner plate here, and for whatever reason they decided they didn't need to. It's an impressive look. I think these are for the truck.
Mm-hmm.
We found that we were not able to get the large size bolts at a reasonable price to bolt the frame together. So what we did was bought rod, threaded it on one end with a nut, threaded it a little bit on the other end, and then put a square nut on, because square headed bolts were what they used almost entirely on this locomotive, and they're getting harder to get. So we welded the head right on there and made this whole bunch of them. I think there's another car also involved, a few bolts for another car we're working on, but by and large they're all for Locomotive 100, and the length is written on the end just for convenience. What you're looking at here are the through bolts that go from one end to the other of the locomotive. You can see the nut and the thread on this end. We're going to have to do a little bit of replacing because they're somewhat deteriorated. In fact, I think it was done before by York Utilities also, because this is what really took the pull when they hooked onto freight cars. And we had to remove them because they were in the way of the work on the car. And what we will do is we will de-rust them and paint them and check the threads all out, and then put it back in, and it'll tie everything together. This is called a transom, and it goes across from one side of the truck to the other. It's simply a big heavy piece of channel. We weren't able to get exactly the same size. Steel shapes have changed somewhat. So we had, in order to get the width, so that this hole through which the bolt I just showed you goes, so it wasn't too close to the edge, we had to weld on this extra piece. So we had the width that was of the original up there. I mean, it's certainly plenty strong. There's no way that anything is going to deteriorate. But we sometimes have to make some compromises, because in 100 years things do change. In fact, sometimes I'm wondering how lucky, I'm wondering how we're going to be able to get some of this stuff.
We're on.
What you see here is the truck frame after sandblasting all the parts, after painting them, and starting to reassemble. We replaced every single bolt and nut, because the old one, this is just a small sample, it's slightly deteriorated. And we then assembled everything, putting caulking between, because we have to do things a little bit more carefully than they did originally, because our exposure is long-term. Having cars that just sit stationary for a long time means moisture can get into areas and doesn't get dried out by motion. Most of this is original except for the bolts. However, the center part, there's a bolster sitting down in the middle. Underneath that is a spring plank. The spring plank is entirely new. It's surrounded by two channels, which are the transom, which go across. The bolster goes up and down between them, and it rests on full elliptic springs. These springs are getting harder and harder to get. You'd think they're very common and you could get them anywhere. Well, that's not true, and we had to look all over the place for them. And finally went to a place in East St. Louis, which made them specially for us. The total cost was about $10,000 for 4 of them. And apparently it's a work of art to get them to come out right. Sir?
I'll let you,
Handwork involved in these. They take the steel, we tell them what the original was. And then we, through various means, in this case taking we had a set of old springs that wasn't too bad, put them in a press and to see how much pressure it took, which I think was about 5 tons to compress it. And we said, make us a pair of springs will be like that. So they make them up and then they put them in a press and they test them and see if it has the right, they call it rate of deflection. And we found that they came out pretty close, so here they are, waiting to go in. What you see here is called an equalizer bar, and it's right about next to where it has to be on the truck. There's a big coil spring that sits in here, and a big coil spring that sits in here, and then there's a journal box. Everything is all scattered around, so it's hard to tell. There's a box here, the end of the axle's in here, it goes inside under here. And when you come to the next exciting episode, you will see where all this stuff goes together. The work we're doing in here we'll probably do during the cold weather because painting isn't involved, and so we don't need quite to have the best temperatures for that.
So where the springs go are the things that Dean Look
Yes.
made.
Yeah, the springs sit in the bottom of these plates here. Now, this looks like a simple piece of steel, and it sort of is, but the original sat in here. For whatever reason, they put a piece of wood in here to have this raised up just slightly higher. That wood plugged up the drain holes, and this filled with water, rotted the wood, and the water, as it froze, expanded and broke the outside of this rim off, where this whole sandwich of wood and metal sat with the spring on top of it. This piece of metal is abrasion-resistant steel because the spring sits on here and rubs back and forth, and it's very, very difficult to work. We had the discs made for us, and they cut the hole. We had to put the holes in them. It was very difficult. We've since learned that their companies can do it a little easier than we did, but that's all in the learning process. The spring seat, the upper ones are in pretty good shape, but the bottom ones, 3 of the 8 survived, but 5 of them had to be rebuilt by our machinist. Great big bolts that we had to make. We duplicated it pretty much as it was. Now, you must have shown this. What I really want to get is an overall as it stands now and an overall as it was. I think this would give something of what he wants.
And so you're using the second truck.
This is our memory.
Right. As a guide to put the first one together, and then you'll dismantle and go through the process.
That's right.
Yeah.
We have, all right.
Yeah.
We deliberately did not take both trucks apart completely because of the time and changes of people from one to the next. Over time, we would find we would lose our pattern, and we would forget how it would go together. So when we get the first one back together, we'll do the second. This will go much faster because, first of all, we know more what we're doing. We've made all the bolts. We've had a lot of the parts sandblasted, the equalizer bars, for instance, and all that. It's all been sandblasted and put back together. The transoms have been replaced, and the stuff with the spring planks. So this will go much faster. But again, we're still not quite ready to put it together yet. What we probably should do is get it all together and then take it out and cover it up. Now you have shown the wheels and axles, have you? Can say about this too. These are the wheel and axle sets for Locomotive 100. On the end of each one, on both ends, you have what they call a journal bearing. The journal bearings were in pretty good shape, but the babbiting, the lining material was all gone. So we've had those rebabbited, and then now we're going all the way down to Machias, Maine to be machined, because our machinist knows somebody down there that figured out how to do it. Between the axles, you have these bearing surfaces on which the motors sit. Now what's on there now is equivalent to the old Cosmoline that they used in the Army for weapons that they wanted to leave outside in the weather. This is a polished surface which we don't want to get rusty. So we put that material on there, and then we'll clean it all off when we finally put everything together. The wheels are in fair condition. I think we can see better from the side.
Yeah.
They have a good wide tread. The flanges are reasonably good, but the tread has been worn down, so there isn't much left. Now, it might take us another 500 years to wear this down the rest of the way, so we figured we would keep them. Plus, these have a kind of an interesting spoke pattern cast into them, so we thought that was historic, and there's no way you could get them like that. You can see it on the back of the other one. Now, I don't know whether this will show or not. Yeah, it can. If you show them right at the end of that, you may want to turn it 90 degrees. Notice this says YUCO, and then the number is the serial number. So this is York Utilities Company, and this was last turned on August 8th, 1927. Now one of these, and we may have too much grease on it, this one, it's awfully hard to see, but it says ASL Railway, Atlantic Shoreline Railway. This was probably done just before the others, but this is the original. Well, no, actually, this is not original. This is the oldest set that we have. The original ones were what they call spoked wheels, and this area would have been open, and they were replaced long ago. The gears are in excellent condition. They look brand new. In fact, you may want to go around to the other side to show you.
Don, are these wrought steel or what's
Yes.
the material?
Yeah. What I want to show, and you can compare the two, this is what they call a split gear. It's meant to be bolted on to the axle, which means you don't have to take the wheels off. All the other three are solid, pressed on. They take the wheel off. All the others are solid gears. They're pressed on after the wheel, or before the wheel is put on, with a tremendous thing called a wheel press. And it's a little bit more modern and more solid. The bolted ones are apt to come loose, whereas these will not. On the other end of the axle is what's called an axle collar, and that's slightly adjusted. The motor goes from one side to the other, fills this whole space up. It rests right on bronze bearings that sit right on here, and then the collar you adjust slightly to fill up the space so the motor doesn't bounce back and forth from one side to the other. These look to be fairly good condition. We may take them off and smooth them up a little bit, but they look better than some I've seen. Okay. Now what Michael's sitting on over here, you may not have taken, well actually, he's sitting next to you. Yeah, there's 3 air tanks. Does that, can you see the Atlantic shore better on that one? Oh, there's, yeah. These are the gear cases that the big gear that you see on the axles fit, and they're meant to protect them from stones flying up, and it also contains the crater grease which lubricates them, crater being the next thing to road tar. These will be sent up to have this grease taken off. We used to, before the EPA said no, burn this crater out, all this grease that's on the outside. They really probably don't need it, but it'd be nice to start with something clean. Of the 2 main air reservoirs that the car carries, and then it has a smaller tank, what they call an auxiliary reservoir. We will test these for 1.5 times their operating pressure, which operates at about 110, so we're going to test it to 165 pounds pressure with water. We pump water in here and then tap all around the outside to make sure there are no problems. If it passes that, then we'll send it out and have it sandblasted and painted. If it doesn't pass, then we have to figure out what kind of a tank we're going to replace it with. This is the vintage wood which we're going to use to replace the end sills. The end sill is a composite of 3 different pieces. This goes under the end sill. The other one is a little bit hard to tell from this arrangement. This is the actual end sill that we'll put the mortises in. We'll sit on top of this, and then there's another piece that goes below it. And if you look in the background, you can almost visualize. There's the old one with all the bolts sticking through them. One of the problems that you have in getting large old timber is that it comes complete with holes. So we're going to see if we can use some of them, but it's unlikely we will, and we'll just plug them. But this is good quality southern yellow pine. Nice and straight. After looking very carefully at the pictures of 100, we discovered that the size of the coal stove that it had. We knew it had one, and we're not sure whether it came over here with one or not, but it had to be just this height because in the pictures it shows below the windows. So thanks to a connection with the 470 railroad, the main narrow gauge in Portland, we were able to get this one donated to us at no cost, and it's just about right. Kind of a cute little thing. Did you say something? Oh, all right. In order to make the locomotive, which is down in the box, come to life, we've collected a lot of pictures of its history and the work that we're doing on it. This particular one is the first panel we've done, and it's the wood and timber work showing project manager Phil Morris tearing up some sills, some flooring rather, and then the actual lead restoration technician tearing the end sill out, and then a deteriorated side sill. We have a lot of pictures, and we think it brings it to life. What we have done is we made a matrix of dated photographs, so we know pretty well what the period of time was that each one of these is showing. And then we took and put the various characteristics that we noted, like the year built, the type of wood that it had, whether it had a sandbox on it or not, whether the air compressor was under the body or whether it was inside, the type of wheels that it had, whether it had lettering or a logo on the outside, what color the number was, what color the body appeared to be, and then some other details. And we went back and forth, and we found that the best period seems to be about 1935 to 1940. The company was still quite viable, the locomotive was in fairly good shape, but it had assumed by and large, the way it came to us. We got it in 1949, and the only thing they had done significantly, they had painted it one more time, and then they painted it one more time yet. They painted it the red and white, and then they painted it the green, which is what we thought it was at all times. And our analysis, color analysis, showed that it was really black.